My name is Naitore Nyamu. I work at Physicians for Human Rights as the head of office for Physicians for Human Rights Kenya. On 10th of December 2020, which is also the International Human Rights Day, the High Court in Nairobi, this is the Constitutional and Human Rights Division, delivered a landmark decision for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. So this case was filed in 2013 by 8 survivor petitioners. So we had 6 female survivor petitioners and 2 male survivor petitioners who were joined by 4 organizations. These include Physicians for Human Rights, Independent Medical Legal Unit, ICJ Kenya, and COVA, Coalition on Violence Against Women. So as I've mentioned, this case has been in court for the last 7 years, so this decision was really an exciting decision. It's the first of its kind in Kenya and even around the world, where the court is holding the state responsible for sexual and gender-based violence that has been committed during conflict. This is just having in mind that these violations took place during 2007, 2008, post-election violence. So the court held the government of Kenya responsible for violations of various rights for some of the survivor petitioners in this case. The other thing that's quite exciting about this decision is that the court awarded 4 of the survivor petitioners 4 million each as general damages for what they went through. So we are really excited because of the journey so far, where we've come from, and just having this decision being delivered even on the International Human Rights Day. That's just the icing on the cake, and the survivors as well are really excited about that. However, the journey really continues because, as I've mentioned, the court just awarded some of the survivor petitioners, not all of them, the general damages. And also in terms of recognizing their rights or that were violated, the court just recognized rights of the 4 of the survivor petitioners. In terms of the next steps, of course, all the organizations that were involved in this case are at the moment deliberating on what to do in moving forward, but we have to ensure that all rights of the sexual and gender-based survivors are safeguarded by the government. The government has a state responsibility to investigate, conduct prosecutions, and also offer meaningful reparations for the violations. So we have to make sure that the 8 survivor petitioners access justice, and justice is served for all of them. So we'll also conduct a lot of advocacy, both nationally and internationally, just to make sure that survivors' rights are upheld at all times. But we're also looking at the coming general elections. In a few years, we'll be having elections, so we will work ensure that we do not have a repeat of the same. And this will involve just working with the government, liaising with them, and just ensuring that the right measures, safety measures are in place to ensure that we do not have a repeat of where women, girls, men and boys are sexually violated just because we have an election. So there's a lot of work ahead of us in terms of advocacy, in terms of enforcement of this judgment, in terms of just working with the larger group of survivors who are not specifically part of these the 8 survivor petitioners who got some sort of reprieve from the case. So there are numerous survivors in the country of sexual and gender-based violence.
The court did not give a time frame on the actualization of the compensation, and Kenyans are concerned on the implementation bit, if at all it will be implemented.
So the implementation of the compensation part of the judgment, of course, is a point to worry, because this is not the first case whereby we are worried about whether or not the government will meet its obligation to execute judgments and ensure that it pays the compensation which is paid out by the court. So it requires quite a bit of sustained advocacy to ensure that we exert the necessary pressure on the government to remind them of their responsibility to meet the obligations as set out by the courts of law. Hopefully this will be done soon.
And as lawyers who joined hands to file the petition, what are some of the challenges that you experienced?
Well, we definitely experienced quite a plethora of challenges. There are very many. I don't think we have enough time to discuss all the number of challenges. And it was not only the lawyers who joined hands, but also the institutions which came together. I originally joined this case as a member of the Coalition on Violence Against Women, as one of its staff members. and have worn different hats ever since. After I left that organization, I also worked as a consultant for the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa, and then now as a pro bono consultant for the consortium. So it's at different levels. So it's not only the lawyers, but also the institutions and also other comrades who we have still stuck, in this fight, even as individual consultants, including people like Nelly Warega and Christina Lai, Stella Ndirango. So just appreciating them. So it's a large group of people, and also not forgetting the survivor petitioners. So the challenges, you can look at them at different levels, so I'll only highlight about 4 of them. And the first was really the coordination of the consortium, which came together. So this was coordinating a large group of institutions, and then choosing the institutions, or rather just selecting the ones who are willing to stay the course throughout, and also together with the survivor petitioners. So ensuring that consistent coordination throughout was a challenge, but we are happy that we still have quite a healthy group of people who continue to support this case. The second really is around the survivor petitioners themselves, because when you are asking, they are here so that they can fight for their rights, but we always have to remember that they are living in certain conditions whereby they have such pressing needs and priorities. And continuing the course of this case was quite challenging for them because they needed support and assistance, which was ongoing. So it was a challenge to continue, looking for funding, maybe to just help them out, maybe with some socioeconomic needs, and especially psychosocial support for them to continue participating in this case. Because imagine being in court for 7 years and then hoping for a good outcome, and then now we have the judgment, which has a partial, very good outcome, but then also excluded 4 victim petitioners. So we always have to remember, what are these needs and priorities? Are we making sure that we put in place the adequate measures to do no harm? So that has been a challenge throughout the pendency of the case. The third I'll highlight is the court process. The court process was very tedious. For a case which was filed in February 2013, we waited close to a year for the government to file its responses, and only after we had put in place a very successful communications and media campaign to press the government to make sure that it put in place, it filed its responses. So we already started with the delays from the onset. And then we put together such a wonderful case. We had 17 witnesses come and provide oral testimony in court. But immediately after we had done that, we had Justice Lenaola, who was the judge who was hearing us. Originally, he was promoted to the Supreme Court, and congratulations to him. But at that time, he couldn't move with the case to the Supreme Court. So we had to be transferred to another judge. In total, we have gone through, I believe, a total of 6 judges. By the time Justice Weldon Korir issued the judgment on 10th of December 2020, about a week ago. And unfortunately, Justice Weldon Korir didn't have the opportunity to hear any of the oral evidence or the testimony in the case, and he had to rely only on the written submissions and the written statements and the written judge's notes. We would have liked very much to give oral highlights of our submissions. However, we were interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, of course, when we had the scaling down of court operations, we had to make a choice, because the case was going to be further delayed if we had to wait for oral highlights of submissions. But we are happy anyway that we have a judgment. It is positive in certain aspects. Of course, there's quite a bit of missed opportunities, and we do hope that this may be accomplished through an appeal process.
How much have you invested in this case?
The funding in this case has been a challenge. Sustaining funding for public interest litigation and strategic impact litigation is always a challenge. You ask anybody who does this kind of work. There is quite a bit of money which was invested in this case. Just think about the fact that the conversations around these cases of complementarity started around 2009, and the conceptualization of the cases started in 2010. Witness statement taking, took hold in 2012, and we've been in court ever since until recently. And even on days when we have to continue meeting with survivors, we have to continue with advocacy campaigns. It's not only about court costs, but everything else that comes with such a huge legal advocacy initiative. So funding has been very challenging, and it's also just thanking the funders that we have had. who have supported this case thus far, including the Open Society Initiative for Eastern Africa. And if I was to do a rough estimate, I'd know for a fact we're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I just can't confidently say how many, or maybe if I'm not allowed to say how many hundreds of thousands of dollars, but that should really give you an idea, especially when we have a compensation order for 16 million shillings, where it's $160,000, which has been awarded as compensation by the courts. You know, some people have asked whether it was worth it, and I believe it was, because even one win, and this is not a small win, this is a big win, is worth it. And also we have to continue the fight, because this is not only about the 4 or the 8 victim petitioners who participated in the case, but also the larger group. So what I would be making, you know, a kind plea is for the funders who have been funding us thus far, including the Open Society Initiative for East Africa, Eastern Africa, to continue funding us and providing support in the next stages of the case, whether that's an appeal or ongoing advocacy, and also for any funders who would wish to support this good cause to also do so, because really some people always say justice is not cheap, and in this case it's not. We still need to continue funding the strategies in the case, but also providing a certain level of support for the survivor petitioners as they continue to navigate this case.
So what are the current needs of the survivors of 2007-2008 post-election sexual violence?
We can start with the most pressing. It's usually the financial needs. As you may be aware, these are individuals who, before the post-election fracas, a lot of them had small businesses that they were running, some of them were employed, but once they were violated, all that really drastically changed. A number of them weren't able to sustain their businesses just because either they had medical issues that they had to deal with, of course the emotional scarring and baggage that they were now bearing made it difficult to sustain these businesses. So they lost their businesses, and sad to say, especially for the petitioners in the case, they haven't been able to regain these sorts of businesses that they were running. And they haven't been able to find meaningful employment since then, because as I mentioned, they have recurring needs, and a lot of those are medical needs. That means that sometimes they can't be in a workplace for, you know, a certain amount of time, so they have a lot of economic needs that they're still unable to meet. I can't say that there's any of them right now that has some sort of steady income, and bring into that the pandemic, it's just made everything worse. So I think that's one of the most pressing needs that they have now. And as you're aware, it's difficult to meet other things when your most basic of needs is not being met. So when you start talking about their emotional needs and mental status, that's something that also just piles onto that. Which brings me to the second point, and that's of their medical needs. When the violations happened, some of them, of course, had a lot of physical injuries, from the fighting and struggles that came with being sexually violated. So there are some who broke hip joints, some had broken legs, scars and things that needed to be attended to. But beyond that, there was now the unseen suffering that they were going through. So with their mental status, Physicians for Human Rights was able to support psychological assessments for the 8 petitioners in the case, the 8 survivor petitioners in the case. And of the 8, 7 were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and 1 was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. And the psychological assessments were done in 2014 and 2015. The violations occurred in 2007, 2008. So you can see how many years this has been since the violations and up to the point at which they were diagnosed and the treatment process started for them. And so it's not to say that once the treatment process started that they were magically healed. It has been work for them to be able to work through what happened to them, a lot of psychotherapy that they had to do. Most of them had not disclosed to their families what had happened. And so those are all things that had to happen. And aside from their own personal trauma, there's also the point at which, for example, for one of the victim petitioners, the violations happen in front of her children. And so the children are also suffering from the same trauma. It has taken a lot of assistance. Some also had to move from where they were staying to be able to just start the healing process for their families. And those are the ones who still have their families with them. A lot of them have suffered through abandonment and stigma and just terrible discrimination, the sexual violations that occurred to them. And so these are things that they're still living with, because the friends they once had are no longer part of their lives. Some family members still don't know, and so the psychotherapy that they've been undertaking is not something that, it's just a momentary thing. It needs to keep happening to make sure that the healing continues. Thirdly, I would just like to say there's the issue of acknowledgement and the perpetrators being held accountable for what happened to the petitioners. And so, of course, that's current because, we've seen what has happened with the appeal process and the judgment that only acknowledged 4 of the 8 survivor petitioners. So the need for accountability is definitely urgent, just because with the judgment and the 4 being awarded compensation and leaving out the 4, there's still a lot of dissatisfaction among the survivor petitioners, and there's the need for them to still walk the journey together and still seek that acknowledgement for the entire group. So that's still a very pressing need for them, and they're determined to see it through, and they're determined to walk the journey together. And that's just as a result of the support they've shown each other over the years, and speaks to their resilience throughout everything that has happened. They have shown a lot of growth and a lot of togetherness and support and resilience. And as you can see, it's paying off, and they're definitely going to keep supporting each other. Lastly, I want to talk about the need for guarantees from the state for non-repetition of the violations that occurred to them. Since 2007, we've had 2 election cycles, and during these election cycles there were constant calls from the survivor petitioners citing their feelings of unsafety, where they're feeling like they need to move, feeling like what happened to them in 2007, 2008 is going to happen again, just feeling unsafe, insecure, distrusting of the community, distrusting of the state, and just uncomfortable. And throughout both cycles, we've been able to assist them with not only the ongoing psychotherapy, but ad hoc support group sessions where they're able to speak to each other, speak to a psychologist, and just get that sense of safety. And for some, the only control they could get was moving from where they're staying to a newer place where they feel like no one knows them, no one knows the struggles they've had to go through, and that sort of that lack of safety, that lack of comfort, that fear that they constantly have to walk around with, it disrupts their entire lives. It disrupts their businesses. It has disrupted their families. It has disrupted their jobs for those who had employment. They lack that stability. And so the government needs to really think about ensuring that this doesn't happen again. And I'm sure my colleagues have spoken about how the government can do that. And we intend to continue pushing, whether it's through advocacy and having the survivors' voices heard, because they do have a lot to say. And it's the experiences that we are trying to share. So I think those are the 4 important things that at least I would like to share based off of what they've told me, what I've heard, and what I've seen.
So following the fresh threats to victims of post-election violence, what do you think the government should do to avoid a repeat of conflict-related sexual violence?
So in terms of what the government needs to do, I think first it starts with accountability for past violations, right? So we are now talking about the 2007 violence. We're talking, when it comes to this particular judgment, but let's also remember that violence happened in 2017. The difference here may just be the magnitude, but we do know that there were new survivors from the 2017 election. We know some survivors were actually repeat victims, right? Meaning they were violated in 2007 and again they experienced violence in 2017. So if we want to move forward, we cannot pretend that the past has happened, right? So I would say, number 1, ensure justice and accountability for those past violations, and 2, put in measures that would then ensure that violence does not happen again. Now, these measures, we would need to get into it and look at the different state agents, different offices, and what responsibilities and obligations their officers have. And then, perhaps we can. So, for instance, let me talk about the police. One of the things that the government can do is to ensure there's knowledge and proper capacity building within the police for them to actually understand the issues of human rights, and for them to actually understand that their responsibility is to protect. So when the government sends the police to the community, right, their duty is to protect citizens, not to violate them, right? And so you have instances where citizens are relying on these same people for protection and for safety, but then they're the same ones who end up being perpetrators. So one, start by ensuring police are aware of their duties and they're aware that failure to adhere to those duties and responsibilities, there are consequences, right? And for them to also know that in the event that there is violence, it is also the duty of the police to ensure that people who come to report cases are not sent away, proper investigations are conducted, and 2, there's also proper coordination between the police and the ODPP's office. So when I talk about the different state offices and agents, that coordination would be very important. So we have the police and the ODPP, perhaps also with the electoral bodies working together, with civil society organizations working together, to ensure that there's proper coordination to provide an environment for survivors where in the event that violence actually happens, survivors have the opportunity to come out and to report. And even where survivors do not report, for those who are responsible to know that it is their duty to go out there and to seek out those who may be victims and those whose cases need to be addressed. What else needs to be done? I think I'd talk about issues of budgeting and financing. One of the biggest challenges that a lot of state offices will talk about is that they don't have the monetary capacity and resources to put in the right measures that that are required to ensure that citizens are protected. So we're talking human resource. If it's the government to ensure that enough resources, adequate resources are allocated to hire more police officers if need be, to pay them well, and to ensure that if we required to, for instance, put one-stop reporting centers where survivors can go to get help, we're talking enough resources to also ensure that there's enough human resource to conduct investigations. There's resources to award for compensation. I mean, we're also seeing that this issue of compensation is coming up when we talk about the 2007 PV. So I mean, it's not all these things cannot be done in isolation, right? We need resources, we need capacity building, we need ensuring people have the knowledge and they understand, right? I think I'd say that for now. So there was also the case that was filed by internally displaced persons from the 2007 case. I didn't, actively participate, but I was, in an organization that was also supported survivors to file this case. This case was, like I've said, filed by internally displaced persons, from the 2007 post-election violence period. It's also a matter that is still pending before the courts, and that matter also has a component of sexual violence, because there are a number of survivors who filed this case who are also sexually violated, and they experienced a lot of GBV while they were living in camps. So that matter is still at the court. And the reason why this particular 2007 case is also a very landmark case is because there has not really been another similar case that has been filed in this country, and in many others that we have tried to look at cases that a case that has been filed by survivors of sexual violence who have gone to court to ensure that there's accountability for state failure to protection, state failure to prevention of violence, state failure to investigation and prosecution, and for compensation for harm that has been suffered by the victims. So this is a landmark case, and we're happy that at least we've gotten good jurisprudence from here. There's still a lot more that needs to be discussed, because the case also, there are a number of missed opportunities, which I think as you've seen, one of us has probably talked about in the previous interview. But I mean, baby steps. We've made good progress in this particular case, and we won't stop here.
So any takeaway messages?
I think the takeaway here for me, I would say justice and accountability, no matter how long it takes, it comes. It comes. And it's unfortunate that survivors have had to wait this long. We're talking about 2007, right? And this case was filed in 2013. So it's almost 8 years now. And survivors have been going to court for all these years, and there've been moments of weakness where people feel like, what's the point? But we have seen the result. We have seen that if you know what is right, and if you believe in your rights as an individual, then that fight is not in vain. And so we just hope that this landmark decision is going to be a decision that will really influence how we move forward as a country, and how we respect each other as human beings, how we respect women. It's just an environment in which we respect each other and we respect each other's rights.